Tonight we're focusing on the topic of solidarity, an aspect of it. This is often called Catholic social teaching. Delighted to be welcoming all of you who are returning from 2 weeks ago and those who are coming for the first time. And now delighted to welcome back Dr. Aoife McGrath, lecturer in moral theology at St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth. Céad míle fáilte arís, Aoife, and we're delighted to have you back and look forward to hearing what you're going to say to us about the topic of solidarity.
And good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our second Lenten talk. In our first talk, we covered a lot of ground, reflecting on what the Church teaches in relation to the poor. We started with Leo XIII's document, Rerum Novarum, which was published in 1891, and skipped to Leo XIV's document in 2025, De Lexite. And we looked at the Church's understanding of human dignity as something infinite and beyond all circumstances. Building on that understanding of the equal dignity of all, tonight we turn to the call of solidarity with the poor. I will share some insights from Pope John Paul II and Pope Francis, using their own words insofar as possible, so that you have a sense of what they felt was important in their social teaching related to our topic and where they placed emphasis. So for the little bit of history in relation to Catholic social teaching on solidarity, we turn now to John Paul II. He issued an encyclical on human work in 1981 to mark the 90th anniversary of Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum. In this document, John Paul affirmed that the Church considers it as its task always to call attention to the dignity and rights of those who work, and to condemn situations in which that dignity and those rights are violated. He observed that the poor appear under various forms, in various places, and at various times. In many cases, he said, the poor appear as a result of the violation of the dignity of human work, either because the opportunities for human work are limited as a result of the scourge of unemployment, or because a low value is put on the work and rights that flow from it, especially the right to a just wage and to the personal security of the worker and his or her family. He believed that work expresses and increases the person's dignity, that the person achieves fulfillment as a human being, and in a sense, the person becomes more a human being through work. In this context, John Paul considers employment a fundamental issue. And that's not just the question of finding work, but more accurately, the issue of suitable employment for all who are capable of it. He remarked that unemployment is the opposite of a just and right situation in this field. And the language he uses is quite strong. He sees unemployment as, in all cases, an evil, which, when it reaches a certain level, can become a real social disaster. He says, and I quote, "It is particularly painful when it especially affects young people who, after appropriate cultural, technical, and professional preparation, fail to find work and see their sincere wish to work and their readiness to take on their own responsibility for the economic and social development of the community sadly frustrated." So John Paul emphasized the ethical value of work. This ethical value, he says, is linked to the fact that the one carrying out the work is a person. All actions of work are carried out by a person and must serve the humanity of the person. Thus, work is for the person, not the person for work. Or in other words, the person is the purpose of work and not the other way around. In general, John Paul was concerned with the different ways society is structured and the basic principles by which a society could be evaluated. And one of those principles, as I say, is the principle of the primacy of the person. The primacy of the person over things was the way he put it. And throughout history, we have heard of, or maybe seen, or even experienced the various ways in which work has been used against people. John Paul observed how work is used to oppress. Human labor has been exploited. And he recalled how people were punished within the system of forced labor in concentration camps. All of these instances violate the dignity and rights of workers and are unjust from the point of view of social morality. Thus, in John Paul's words, the rights of the human person are the key element in the whole of the social moral order. One further point about John Paul's vision of social morality before we look specifically at solidarity. He made a distinction which is useful for understanding what injustice looks like in this area. He referred to the responsibility of the direct employer, by which he means the person or institution with whom the worker enters into a work contract. So we can grasp the types of injustices that might appear in the context of such direct one-to-one relationships, if you will, between the employer and the employee. For example, issues concerning work conditions or payment or job security. But John Paul also introduced a concept of the indirect employer, who he says has a true responsibility, even if it is an indirect responsibility in this area. This concept of the indirect employer is a more complex concept, and it speaks to the interdependent way our social systems work. We have become increasingly more aware of how interdependent we are in our contemporary world, especially following the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing recent global conflicts. How events and decisions in one part of the world have a real, if indirect, impact on our daily lives and the conditions within which we live in another part of the world. We need only look at what is displayed on fuel pumps and prices of fuel recently. I will try to explain this concept briefly. The notion of indirect employers covers those persons and institutions or networks of influences that determine the whole socio-economic system. It is that whole system which creates the conditions within which the direct employer and the employee do their business, of deciding the concrete terms of their employment contract. Ultimately, it is the wider system which impacts the person's ability to attain employment, a fair wage, and security. So in relation to this notion, we might consider, for instance, how customers, by purchasing products and demanding low prices, could be considered indirect employers, because the pressure from the customer forces shops to lower prices, which means producers, who are direct employers, are forced to lower costs. And this often results in lower wages or poor working conditions for actual workers. So John Paul's concept of the indirect employer is meant to help us understand the wider sphere of responsibility which contributes to and shapes injustice in our world. It includes the responsibilities of an individual state and the significance of social and economic policies. It also highlights the mutual dependence between states and global economic policy and the real effect this can have in our societies. It provides a framework for evaluating the conduct and assessing the responsibilities of multinational or transnational corporations. But it also challenges each of us to reflect on our own complacency or indeed complicity in unjust structures of society, to reflect on how our behaviour might contribute to a society that is unjust, whether nationally or globally, to consider how our decisions and actions may ultimately create the conditions within which others are impoverished. Perhaps we protect our own interests at the expense of others, or we remain apathetic or indifferent to the consequences of our actions, whether those are intended or not, and how those actions shape society. In this light, the option for the poor that we have been exploring this Lent implies a commitment to stop being unjust, to try to change unjust structures in our society, to consider how we might be partly responsible for those structures, and to disentangle ourselves from those actions and behaviours that shape unjust structures. So this brings us to the principle of solidarity. In some sense, we can speak of the solidarity of the poor. We might think of it like peer-to-peer, or in this instance, poor-to-poor, the poor helping each other. That is what John Paul II was implying when he spoke about the struggle of workers for justice, how they unite to secure their rights for the good of the needs and merits of working people. He thus advocated for the importance of unions. In expressing solidarity with each other, uniting in a community for a common cause, workers are also exercising their own agency in the face of injustices and poverty. In addition to this solidarity of the poor, we also need to talk about solidarity with the poor. This principle is also grounded in our social nature, in the oneness of our common humanity that calls us to shared action for the betterment of all. It challenges us to move beyond the mere recognition of the reality of our shared humanity, beyond acknowledging our interdependence, into a sphere of ethical, social action. In fact, John Paul viewed solidarity not just as a principle, but as a moral and social attitude, as a virtue. In his encyclical on social concern of the Church that was published in 1987, he said solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to commit oneself to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. The type of solidarity John Paul is speaking of then is when members of society recognize one another as persons and accept we have responsibility for one another. He says, those who are most influential, because they have a greater share of goods and common services, should feel responsible for the weaker and be ready to share with them all they possess. Those who are weaker, for their part, in the same spirit of solidarity, should not adopt a purely passive attitude or one that is destructive of the social fabric, but while claiming their legitimate rights, should do what they can for the good of all. The intermediate groups, in their turn, should not selfishly insist on their particular interests, but respect the interests of others. So, our awareness of our interdependence must be transformed into solidarity, based upon that principle that the good of creation is meant for all. For John Paul, this concept of solidarity helps us to see the other, whether that's a person, a people, or a nation, not just as some kind of instrument with a work capacity and physical strength to be exploited at a low cost and then discarded when no longer useful. But he says they should be treated as a neighbour, a helper, to be made a sharer on a par with ourselves in the banquet of life to which we are all equally invited by God. This value of solidarity continues to be central in more recent social teaching. For example, in 2022, Pope Francis published an encyclical on fraternity and social friendship, or in Latin, Fratelli Tutti, which I mentioned in our first session. Pope Francis suggested that goodness, together with love, justice, and solidarity, are not achieved once and for all. They have to be realized each day. It is not possible to settle for what was achieved in the past and complacently enjoy it, as if we could somehow disregard the fact that many of our brothers and sisters still endure situations that cry out for our attention. Considering our basic theme of beyond almsgiving, it is interesting to reflect on Francis's description of solidarity. He says it finds concrete expression in service, which can take a variety of forms in an effort to care for others. Service, in a great part, means caring for vulnerability, for the vulnerable members of our families, our society, our people. In offering such service, individuals learn to set aside their own wishes and desires, their pursuit of power, before the concrete gaze of those who are most vulnerable. Just as John Paul II said solidarity was not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of others, Francis says solidarity means much more than engaging in sporadic acts of generosity. It means thinking and acting in terms of community. It means that the lives of all are prior to the appropriation of goods by a few. It also means combating the structural causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of work, land and housing, and the denial of our social and labour rights. Finally, while we unfortunately do not have time to explore it here tonight, I recommend that you read Chapter 2 of Fratelli Tutti, which is entitled A Stranger on the Road. In this chapter, Pope Francis offers an extended reflection on the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is so familiar to us all, but which is so rich in its potential for continuously evoking new insight. Francis suggests all of us have in ourselves something of the wounded man, something of the robber, something of the passers-by, and something of the Good Samaritan. And it can also be said that here and now, anyone who is neither a robber nor a passerby is either injured himself or herself, or bearing an injured person on his or her shoulders. One detail about the passers-by in the parable that Pope Francis says stands out, and which is relevant for our Lenten reflections, is that the passers-by were religious, devoted to the worship of God, a priest and a Levite. Francis says this detail should not be overlooked. It shows that the belief in God and the worship of God are not enough to ensure that we are actually living in a way pleasing to God. He says a believer may be untrue to everything that his faith demands of him, and yet think he is close to God and better than others. For Pope Francis, this parable eloquently presents the basic decision we need to make in order to rebuild our wounded world. He indicates that in the face of so much pain and suffering, our only course is to imitate the Good Samaritan. Any other decision would make us either one of the robbers or one of those who walk by without showing compassion for the sufferings of the person on the roadside. He reflects that the parable speaks to us of an essential and often forgotten aspect of our common humanity. We were created for a fulfillment that can only be found in love. We cannot be indifferent to suffering. We cannot allow anyone to go through life as an outcast. Instead, we should feel indignant, challenged to emerge from our comfortable isolation, and to be changed by our contact with human suffering. He says that that is the meaning of dignity. So I will pause here for tonight. In our final session, in a fortnight's time, we will reflect on how our deeper understanding of dignity and our growth in solidarity with the poor leads us to questions of justice and transformative action in our society and our world.
Thank you, Aoife. And those words were pretty challenging, weren't they? And I'm sure it has caused you, and certainly it has caused me, to reflect on my own life. And it helps us to understand why we have invited our next speaker. Before I say who it is, even though some of you may recognize him, especially if you live in Killarney, to remind you that, of course, we have a question and answer opportunity for you, and you'll find that at the bottom of your screen. So you can put in any questions that you may have for Aoife or indeed for Seánn as he'll begin to speak to us. So I have in my hand, of course, a Trócaire box, and I'm sure many of you have it, maybe not in your hand, but on your kitchen table. That's the introduction we want to give to Mr. Seánn Farrell, Seánn for us tonight, still known probably as the new man. I was talking to my parish priest earlier. He said, "Is that the new man?" I said, "Yes, that's the new man." I'm not sure when you'll stop being the new man, Seánn. So Seánn Farrell is the Chief Executive of Trócaire. And when we think of Lent, we think of the Trócaire box and the people that we are in solidarity with in a particular way this Lent, the people of Rwanda. So Seánn, what are you going to say to us tonight? I leave it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, and lovely to join all of you this evening. I'm going to start off with where Aoife really expounded on the whole idea of solidarity, particularly in the context of the teachings of the Church, around the whole concept that we think and act together and that all human lives are important, and as our Church teaches us, that all human life and other life has a dignity, and that we as a Church have a prophetic role in the protection and in the safeguarding of all life. And what I want to speak about is some of the challenges in our world today, and then how we are all called to engage with the world, taking that core principle of solidarity. And I'm going to speak about three issues and maybe give some examples on each. I'm going to talk about some of the cuts that we have seen, particularly in funding and what that's doing globally. I'm going to talk about the climate crisis a little bit, and then I also want to talk about conflict. So if we start off on the whole area of cuts, for me, I suppose it's easy to see numbers on a page and say these are the funding cuts that we've seen, particularly from USAID and the UK and everywhere else. And they appear as figures on a page. But we know in our experience of Trócaire that they're not figures on a page. They are the damage done to lives all over the world. They are the young women who turn up looking for medical care while pregnant at a clinic in sub-Saharan Africa and cannot get medicine. They are the desperate families that bring their children to a clinic where now there's no malaria medication left. They are the organisations all over the world who do amazing work in trying circumstances and no longer have funding to keep that work going. And I think for me, the moral question in all of this is, how do we build a world without poverty, which is central to who and what we are as a church? And how do we do that in an era when so many of our Western governments are making horrendous decisions to cut aid programs that help the poorest and use that money consistently in the pursuit of military expenditure and war. And this movement of huge money from helping the poorest of the poor, the furthest behind, into a context where all of that money is now being used in armaments and used in war is a huge moral question for the world we live in. The second topic I want to touch on is the climate crisis and climate change. And we know that climate change affects all. We've seen the recent flooding here at home in Ireland, and we've seen the impact that had on families all over the country and particularly in the southeast. So climate change is with us. But what we also know is that it affects those in poorest places much more. So while it affects all, it does not affect all of us equally. Sylvia showed the picture of the Trócaire box this year, a family of 3 generations on the front of the box in western Rwanda, whose areas where they live in small farms where they grow their crops in order to have enough food to send their kids to school, where those areas are currently massively flooded, and after floods usually comes drought. I can remember working for Trócaire, standing in a small village in northern Uganda in the aftermath of the war, where we were supporting families move from these huge camps back to where they were living in their villages. They had planted their crops, they were trying to create life again after a horrible conflict. And in 2011, when the year I was there with those communities, what we saw a drought where it didn't rain for 11 months. The crops wilted in the fields. Even the water points that we had supported dried up because the water table was so low. And standing with people under a mango tree, talking about the challenges and pain in their lives as climate change really began to impact. They said to me, Seán, we think this is a punishment from God. We think we are being punished because there was so much killing and violence during the war in our country. And one old man said, our bullets have wounded the sky, and that is why we have no rain. So you had a people who did the least to cause the global phenomenon around climate change, actually paying the highest price. And again, in that, there is a big moral question, particularly as articulated brilliantly by Pope Francis in Laudato Si. And the third area I want to speak about briefly is conflict. 1 in 6 children now globally live in an area of conflict, and there are more conflicts now in the world than at any stage since World War II. We turn on the news at night and it's images from Ukraine, from Gaza, and now in the last couple of days, yet another war in the Middle East as Israel and the US commenced the attacks on Iran, and Iran responded by attacking a number of its neighbours in the Gulf. And in many of the places where we work, Sudan in the midst of a civil war, Myanmar, the teams we have as Trócaire, and the local organisations that we work with across the world, increasingly we are responding in areas where conflict is worse and deeper than ever before. And I guess sometimes the challenge of responding in this sort of huge challenge in time can be really difficult. But I maybe want to finish with something that Aoife talked about when she talked about Catholic social teaching and Pope Francis's and John Paul II talking about solidarity not being a feeling. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in the West Bank, and I was there at a time when Palestinian families were being driven out of their homes as I think the annexation of the West Bank is clearly happening now. And it was hard to see where there was any hope in the situations for so many people. But one evening, we had 3 people come to meet us. One was a Jewish Israeli woman, the second was a Palestinian Christian man, and the third was a Palestinian Muslim man. And the three of them sat with us and they all shared one thing, and all of them had lost children in the conflict. And it was heartbreaking to listen to, first of all, their stories of deep pain, of having lost a child, but also how they had gone beyond hatred to actually beginning to think about hope and to think about how their role now coming out of that pain was to build bridges together. And that for me is solidarity in action. And I want to leave you with one phrase before I finish, which is the Jewish Israeli woman said to us, hope is not a feeling, hope is an action. And for us as Trócaire, I think we take that every day. I think we bring it to all the places where we work. And I think based on Catholic social teaching and the values we hold as a church, that idea that hope is an action is more true now than ever before in our world. Thank you very much. And back to you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Seánn. And it leaves room for questions, for reflection. And as we were planning this series with Aoife suggested that we take a break in between our different weeks, which is what we've done, even though sometimes that can be a little bit, you may lose people. Hopefully we haven't lost too many people. And also for those of you to remind you that those of you who missed last week, or maybe, for example, have to miss tonight, they're on the Diocese of Kerry YouTube channel. So you can do all your catching up by clicking in there. So Aoife has reminded us that it's not just the odd little, act of generosity, and she wasn't quoting herself. And Seánn has reminded us of just the amazing solidarity that is being shown in places, even to the 3 generations of the family in Rwanda. I suppose it leaves us speechless, but we see examples of it in our own communities. But now we're realizing that our family is getting broader and broader. So, Aoife, would you like to say any little word to us, or Seánn, would you like to say another word to us in response to what each other has said? And the recent only last Saturday, obviously, another war started. And since then, I heard somebody from Trócaire speaking on the radio. She was your director in Lebanon about the huge new poor, people who are already poverty struck or stricken and now having to be displaced yet, or are displaced yet again. New poor are being created all the time, and our hearts are being asked to kind of expand and expand. Yeah. Aoife or Seánn, anything you would want to say?
Well, just to kind of thank Seánn for his words. What struck me as I listened to him is about how complex this it can be, how interconnected everything is. Something that's happening in a vastly different part of the world to our own is deeply affecting us here, and things that we do here can have an impact elsewhere, both positively and negatively. But how unfortunate it is that those that are the most vulnerable are those that suffer the most. And we can feel powerless against the government decisions that are made on our behalf or made in other countries, and what we can do to kind of address the climate crisis, or how can we stand, asking ourselves the realistic question, how do we stand in solidarity with those that are experiencing conflict across the world? I mean, these are huge, complex issues and problems, and we can't unduly put a burden on our shoulders to try and respond to everything. However, we can make a difference within our spheres of influence within our different societies. And one example is the amount of work that Trócaire do on behalf of all those that contribute to the funds of Trócaire during the Lenten campaigns and elsewhere. Like those gestures of alms giving are real and effective and have an impact when others do work on our behalf as well. So yeah, I was just struck. I don't know if Seán wants to come back, but I was just struck by that complexity and how we can feel powerless sometimes in the face of that. But actually, just that it was good to hear reflected back in the stories of the people that you met, how hope is not a feeling, hope is an action, how solidarity is not a feeling, it's an action. And so it's good to hear that coming through people's lived experiences as well as in our Catholic social teaching. It kind of shows how relevant our social teaching is because it meets the real life experiences of people.
Yeah, thanks so much, Aoife. I suppose when what you said, Sylvia, I think like in a lot of places where I've worked, I think one of the most difficult things to see is families who are already living in poverty being moved into displacement. So if I take the example of the teams that, I work with now, like Sudan in the midst of what is a brutal civil war, 25 million people now need humanitarian aid and 12 million are displaced. And if you just think about those numbers, that's nearly twice the population of the island of Ireland displaced. Many of them displaced within the country, and many of them then displaced to neighbouring countries like Chad. And I suppose in the 6 years I lived in Uganda, we saw people pushed out of South Sudan during the violence. And I think one of the hardest things I think I experienced was seeing women and children arrive in particular with almost nothing left, just maybe a small little bag, sometimes a plastic bag with a few pieces of clothes and a blanket that to put over a tree where they can get some bit of shelter and start again. And I often think some of the work that we do, I see our work as being dual in those circumstances. And Aoife, you mentioned earlier about how Catholic social teaching asks us to focus on the structural causes. And I would say our work is both. That if you take Sudan today or take Somalia today, we respond to immediate needs, nutrition, clean water, food, what people need. We support people in Gaza living in tents now on the rubble. 900,000 people are now living in tents on the rubble of their homes. And so there is the instinct of supporting the immediate need, but there is also the questioning the structural causes of why people are poor and why poverty exists. And that is about political engagement, and that is about campaigning, and it is about action. So when I look at Sudan today, one of the reasons why this war is so brutal and so terrible and the displacement is so big is because international actors are supporting the two warring parties. And that is honestly what is keeping the war going. Egypt and Saudi Arabia supporting the SAF in the north, and United Arab Emirates supporting the RSF in the south. And it's interesting that external countries are putting more money into the fighting and the arms than all of us are putting into humanitarian aid together. So I think some of this is about like we appeared in front of an Oireachtas committee recently where we named countries who are still facilitating the fighting in Sudan. As you saw, Sylvia, we were on Morning Ireland this week talking about these issues, but also bringing together the two elements of the work, which is inspired by gospel values, which is very much about the supporting people in the immediate at a time when they are at their poorest and at their most vulnerable. And when people are forced into displacement, there is no time more vulnerable in their lives and no time as unsafe and as dangerous, particularly for women. And then it's also about asking the deeper questions around why are people poor, what is happening in these contexts, and demanding political action and holding to account those in power who refuse for their own either personal gains or their own ideological reasons. And we're seeing this now playing out since last Saturday in another war in the Middle East. And so for me, it is about consistently asking the deeper questions and doing political advocacy and campaigning. And finally, I would say, like for us as Trócaire, for the people who support us, I think that support comes in many different ways. Some people will donate to us, they'll put money in the Trócaire box or donate to us however they choose through the church. Others will come to protest. Others will write to their TDs. Others will contact us and offer support. Like when I spoke at the masses in Killarney last weekend, a lot of people came up to me and just said, I just see Bridget's Corrigan's comment there, just saying, I'm amazed and inspired by the work of Trócaire. It's like shoots of grass appearing. Even the support we get is really, really terrific. And, be it material, voice, prayer, presence, or just encouraging us all in the work that we do, I think it all makes a difference. Thanks.
And I'm thinking of, and also spotted Bridget's comment, those who are engaged in trad for Trócaire, those people who love and are gifted in traditional music, and what a wonderful way they enjoy themselves and everybody wins. I'm also struck that, Seánn, you spoke about, the figures, numbers that can be to do with the reduction of US aid or whatever. And it brings me back to there was a man on the mission webinar for the diocese called Jim Gannon, the CEO of Thurles in Limerick. And one of the questions that came in was, how do you cope with all these people, all this? And he said, one at a time, the person who's in front of him. And so all of us can't be in Sudan or in Lebanon or in wherever it is, but we know that there are people, your partners, the partners of Trócaire, who work on the ground, and they are there in our name. And that, I think that gives us hope, such great hope. And to think of the students that Aoife teaches up in St. Patrick's, I think this will put kind of fire in the belly, as it were, to think of what are the ways that we're being complicit. Now, one of the thoughts I was having, and I'm sure we all can be thinking about it, is fast fashion. There's been programs on the radio with the people involved in that who are like in slave labor in certain countries. And just not for us to be so blind, but to look at the labels or to think how often I live in a rural part, but the amount of deliveries that come down the road. And yet this is helping at the moment. How can we pay for petrol? It's getting more and more expensive because of what's going on. Why do we need so much stuff in our lives? So there are big questions that the two of you have put to us. We are delighted to say that we have one more night in this series. And Aoife will be back with us. Trócaire will be with us for the whole of Lent. And we thank Seánn for coming on with us tonight. And I know I heard him say at the 10:30 Mass in the cathedral, when the priest who said, now I hope he's arrived from whatever church he'd been at the night before, or the Mass before, you said that Trócaire is there to save lives and to change lives. And I think by the words that both Aoife and Seánn have said tonight, that lives have been changed and hearts touched and our minds expanded to see, can we be that Samaritan? Maybe it'll cause us to go back to Fratelli Tutti to try to read chapter 2, either for the first time or again. Thanks have come in for all of us, but especially for Aoife and for Seánn, people listening in different parts. And we have another member of JPIC, of which I'm a member, the Justice, Peace and Integrity of Creation Committee, who's now going to give us a final word, a word of hope, maybe the act of hope that Bridget spoke about. So thanks to our two wonderful speakers tonight, and welcome to Evelyn, and we look forward to seeing people again on the 24th.
Solidarity is a big word, and indeed a big concept to grasp. The Irish translation is Neart le Céile, meaning stronger together. Not just me, but we. Solid, the beginning of the word, conjures up images of strength, safety, and support. When we feel strongly enough about a situation, we must move beyond the feeling and get involved in active participation with others to help bring about a positive conclusion to the issue. Because solidarity is deeply connected to sacredness, we must recognise the responsibilities we have to each other and take an active part in helping fellow humans. We humbly ask the Holy Spirit to fill us with empathy and understanding, strength and courage, and a commitment to work together to bring about change. Slán agus Beannacht.